Well, Liz Bruenig, it's a great pleasure to have you on our show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I'm here with Austin,
Hello.
and this is the third episode that we're recording thinking about Christian nationalism. And I know, Liz, you've written quite a bit about the relationship between religion and politics, or rather about religion in politics. So we'd love to pick your brains about this sort of growing movement that we find all, not just in America, but all over the world, actually.
Yeah. Certainly there's been a sort of interesting, I don't want to call it a resurgence because Christianity never, is still a major force in American life and hasn't completely vanished by any means. In fact, the decline seems to have leveled off. But there's been a development, I would say, in right-wing Christian politics under the Trump administration. So I think there's kind of a rightward drift going on in the United States right now, and in several other countries as well. And so I think you're going to see sort of strange forms of Christianity emerge from that.
Well, what do you think accounts for this rightward drift that we're seeing?
It's a good question. I think immigration is a huge part of that. There's been
So
a lot
fears of too much immigration, perhaps.
Right. So in the UK and in France, etc., there's the concern about refugees and migrants from Asia, and in the United States we have refugees and migrants from Latin America, and I think people just have reacted quite badly to this level of immigration, and I think you see it reflected in sort of far-right politics that are ascendant in several countries.
Okay, so it's a fear of immigrants coming, too many immigrants coming into the country who don't share, presumably, the same values that nation is proud of, or something like that.
Right, yeah. Something along those lines. It's like a combination of maybe racial animus and nativist animus, yeah.
Now, that accounts for the nationalism side of it. I guess we can see nationalism as reacting against people not from one's own nation, sort of too many of them coming into the nation and diluting the social cohesion of the nation. Mm-hmm. But what accounts for the Christian dimension of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the United States in particular, Christians, I think there's several things going on. Christianity has declined in the United States, pretty significantly. So I think in the 1980s, something like 90% of people in the United States identified themselves as Christian. And now the number is more like 62%. And I think that
that's a pretty big drop in a short time.
It's a very big drop. And I think Christians in the United States, especially conservative Christians, have been, their sense of Christianity has been sort of disrupted by this. And so I think there's an interest in the Christian right in sort of revisiting an era of Christian cultural hegemony. And I think that desire has been joined fairly successfully with the nationalist project.
Do you think, one of the things I think is interesting about this is, recognizing, especially in the 19th century, one thing that evangelicals were really proud of was that they kind of felt like we've established a Christian nation without using politics and government to do that, right? We did it through kind of revivals and these kinds of things. And that's not to say that there hasn't been a kind of significant political aspect to that, but do you think there's something new in Christians turning back to this model of, hey, let's use the government to kind of enforce and bring us back to this sense of a Christian nation, which before was something that we felt like, the whole point of America being not the separation of church and state. You often have these religious leaders saying like that's a good thing, but we still have a Christian nation. Is there something new happening here where Christians are saying, actually, that didn't work, let's go back to the government implementing this?
Right. I think the Christians around Trump really long for this period of like I was saying, Christian, sociocultural hegemony. And I think in past eras, there just wasn't that much conflict between liberalism and Christianity in America because everybody was Christian, and there was kind of this fusion of, American Protestantism with liberalism. And I think now that the number of Christians has dropped so much, the expectations of non-Christians, who are a significant part of the population, is that there is, fairness, tolerance, no preference or quarter given to any particular religion by the government. And I think the Christians around Trump are very frustrated by that. They feel like their loss of influence in the government is related to their loss of power in society. So they're interested in using the government opportunistically to try to reestablish, Christian political power.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, what would you say, given that we're all Christians, presumably anybody who is a Christian wants their country to be governed by Christian values. And I think what a lot of people either accused of Christian nationalism or who own the label would say is, well, of course, anybody who's Christian wants their country to enact Christian values and be governed by them. So what's wrong with that? What's problematic about that?
Yeah. I don't think there's anything problematic with Christian, anti-liberalism on the whole. Certainly I've been, myself very attracted to those arguments. I think the thing that worries me in this case is, when you say you want the country governed by Christian values, I as a Catholic am thinking of very different values than the, sort of evangelicals surrounding Trump. So why would I throw in with them when, their version of Christianity is sort of radically different than my version of Christianity?
So what it comes down to is who gets to say what counts as Christian values? What are those Christian values?
Right, exactly. And I think the other issue with this is, it's all well and good to say that liberalism is sort of suffocating Christianity and we want to reassert a place for Christianity that's sort of protected from the secularizing forces of liberalism. But that means, that we're looking at a transformation of our politics. And the thing that unsettles me is that what comes after liberalism is not necessarily better than liberalism. And it seems like at the moment things are trending more towards fascism than sort of post-liberal utopian socialism, which is what I would hope for. Yeah.
Could you give us a couple of examples of that trend or to illustrate that trend?
Of general fascism in the United States? Or
Yeah.
Oh, well, I mean, I think the treatment of immigrants right now is a good example. Sending people to, essentially a concentration camp at Sicat in El Salvador. And I think that's, sort of preeminent one. The tendency right now, or the practice of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE agents, wearing masks and no identification to just sort of grab people off the street. That seems very disturbing, having a kind of secret police force. It, seems like a bad idea and seems like something we've resisted in the past that we've taken up now. This sort of, total disenfranchisement of, immigrants and refugees living in the United States along, theoretically national lines. But, I don't think there's more than a whisper of racial animus in this. And so, I think those are the things that make me worry about a continued turn away from liberalism, because the turn away is turned towards something, potentially worse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and evidence of that kind of racial animus is obviously the open arms to white South Africans while, pushing out others. So this isn't just about national questions, mm-hmm. Right? I think that's quite clear. And it is, I think it's fascinating because we've all, been in circles exploring versions of, right-wing, left-wing, post-liberalism. Those kinds of conversations have been going on for a while. And so the basic idea that there's a tension between liberalism and Christianity, I think a broad range of Christians share, but it has been interesting to see, immediately when Trump returns to power, a lot of those Christians saying, wait a second, that's not what we were talking about. And then everyone's like, what? I thought we all agreed. We want to push, against this. I think it's been a kind of fascinating reorientation of a lot of these people who were part of this discussion.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah.
Mm. And you recently had an article that was talking about this, who counts as Christians, right? This idea of Trump has this task force to eradicate anti-Christian bias. I really liked a couple of the examples that you had in there. I wonder if you could talk about those just in terms of like what's being counted as Christian and what's being ignored as kind of anti-Christian bias.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there are real examples of anti-Christian bias or, anti-Christian animus, these sort of attacks on Catholic churches and vandalism of Christian places of worship, been reported across the country, and they've been reported at, kind of record highs, according to the parishes who are, telling, recording vandalism against them. In terms of try to establish what Christianity is, which is something you need to do in order to protect Christians from anti-Christian bias. There are sort of confounding examples, and so one of them is the question of the Westboro Baptist Church, which is sort of uniquely American phenomenon. They're sort of primitivist Baptists, and
Is that the church that used to go and picket people and like put up signs saying homosexuals are going to hell, that kind of thing?
Right. They picketed the funerals of gay people, and interestingly, they also picketed the funerals of soldiers who died in Iraq. And their position was anyone who was defending the United States interests was in fact defending the interests of LGBT people, because the United States is wrongly, in their view, open and accepting of LGBT people. And this is when a lot of those views were broadly changing in the 2000s, 2010s. And, at one point, the Westboro Baptist Church, took their argument that it's their right to protest at funerals, etc., all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found in their favor. At another time, they tried to raise a similar issue before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court denied cert, which means they didn't want to hear the case at all. So the government has sort of reacted differently to the Westboro Baptist Church in terms of sort of establishing what their rights are in terms of religious freedom. And I think it's interesting to put that example before especially conservative Christians, because the Westboro Baptist Church, they say they have scriptural warrants for everything, and I disagree with their reading of Scripture. But certainly they consider themselves very devout Christians, and they share practices with Christians in a way that makes me think, yeah, I disagree with them, but they count as Christian. But what would the Trump Task Force on Eliminating Christian Bias think about stomping on American flags at military funerals? Is that part of legitimate Christian practice? I don't think that many, sort of anti-liberal right-wing Christians around Trump would agree that that is something that you're entitled to do. I think there was also an example I talked about of an Episcopalian church that had its rainbow pride flag stolen and burned. And in the view,
It's quite the opposite end of the spectrum from
right. That's why I included it, because it's another thing to put before conservative Christians and say, look, this denomination said that their flag was stolen and burned because they were Christians, and in their view, accepting everybody and being tolerant is required by Scripture. And so, if you say, well, that's not legitimately Christian, what are you going to appeal to say, that's non-Christian behavior, because they have their scriptural warrants as well, if that's what you're looking at.
So the problem, what you're saying is, the problem with Christian nationalism in the States is not that it is seeking to promote Christian values in politics, but that it's seeking to promote its own version of Christianity to the exclusion of all other possible versions of Christianity.
Yeah, exactly. So I was sort of joking with my friends the other night that, for many, many years, many Christian scholars in the liberal critical sphere have criticized the separation of church and state as this sort of arch-liberal idea that led to the disempowerment of religion and the retreat of Christianity from public life. Yes, I was saying, separation of church and state is something that's frustrated a lot of people. But, this state this church, do we really want them teaming up? It's a messed up state, and it's a messed up, church that's attending to this state. So at this point, I'm saying, well, separation of church and state seems to be protecting us from what could be a really, unholy alliance between this particular state and this particular form of Christianity. Yeah.
Well, William Cavanaugh talked about, he was in favor of the idea of separation of church and state, but he said that's not the same thing as the separation of religion and politics.
Right. Right. I think that's very right.
Yeah, and it is, I mean, obviously Americans always, expand and debate the meaning of these separations. Is it just, what does it mean for the government to establish a particular religion or that kind of thing? But I think, this is, again, from the beginning, part of the problem was that, America was sort of like freedom of religion, but we mostly mean freedom for various types of Protestant Christianity. And so you can see that carrying forward where they're like, we're now mostly interested in it's mostly kind of prosperity gospel megachurches, the people that are surrounding Trump. So a very particular kind of alliance between capitalism and evangelicalism that's being seen as the kind of core of what Christianity is here. And yeah, as you know, there's all of these areas where Christians are massively divided. I mean, it'd be, if you know anything about Christians right now, you know that they're hugely divided over questions of sexuality and gender. And so to sort of say we're going to prioritize one side of that for the Christians is kind of like, well, that's, the main things that Christians right now can't agree on, which side of that is the Christian one. And so the idea is, well, let's let the secular government decide for us, seems to be part of the move.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, in particular, the Christians who are seeking to, erase or reduce this separation of church and state, these evangelicals around Trump, they're, interesting in terms of their religious practice. These are prosperity gospel people. And what do they consider themselves? Part of the new apostolic movement, which is a charismatic movement. And a lot of them think, these pastors, that they receive sort of messages from God and they're in communication with God in a way that other people aren't. And I think that's like you were saying, part of this hybrid of capitalism and Christianity that is, sort of characteristic of the U.S. And I think it's really disturbing.
I wonder, one of the other things that I was thinking of, obviously I was reading some of your recent articles before we met, and the other thing that you wrote about recently that I thought was interesting was this pro-natalism, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the role of kind of pro-natalism, pro-family stuff in Christian nationalism, and also the distinction that you draw between pro-natalism and being pro-family, and what's going on there.
Yeah, pro-natalism, it's obviously a tendency that's existed around the world for a long time in response to sort of falling birth rates, which have happened across the West, and also Asia, worldwide, in fact. But the decreases in birth rates have been, I think, more extreme, more pronounced in the West than they have in other places. Although, to my understanding, is that South Korea has the lowest birth rate in the world. So, I think there are legitimate problems associated with, sort of massive reductions in population. Population decline leads to, sort of the problem of dealing with a bigger population of old people who are no longer working. The task of supporting them falls to a reduced population of young people. And that's going to lead to a lot of issues, a lot of social problems, a lot of economic problems. And so I understand why people are concerned about falling birth rates. Pro-natalism is sort of a response to that. And, in my opinion, the existing pro-natalist movement in the United States, which is almost strictly right-wing, if not entirely right-wing, is that they're interested in raising birth rates, but they're interested, actually in encouraging particular people to have lots of kids. So Elon Musk, I think, has 14 known children and possibly many more, and he's sort of the premier example of this tech pronatalism that is not religious in character; it's secular, and therefore is separated from a lot of Christian values. So when I say that these people who are pro-natalists and who are Christian, are sort of mistakenly including, I think, pro-natalist philosophy, I'm concerned that they're importing a bunch of secular values and sort of diminishing what the Christian approach to family should be, which, I think in any sort of traditional Christian's view is not what people like Elon Musk are doing, right? Just sort of seeding the world without, keeping in touch with the family, actually staying with the family, raising the children himself, in a marriage, in a household, etc. And, that form of pronatalism, because the tech people have all the money, is ascendant. And the Christians attached to it, I think, are relinquishing a great deal of what Christianity has to add in terms of the family, which I think is quite a bit.
Yeah, I thought it was such an interesting because American views of the family, Christian views of the family have always been somewhat ambiguous, right? Like Jesus certainly doesn't, and Paul don't have great things to say about family necessarily, and so there's never been a central piece of the Christian belief that this is all about family. But in the kind of development of Christian thought, we obviously have a kind of central sense that the family is a space for the kind of nurturing, growing up of children, and that piece in leading to human flourishing in society and all of that. There's a really kind of important understanding of that. But I just think it's fascinating how this pro-natalism movement is completely unhooked from any of that. Right? Have as many children as you can with as many women as you can, and as you noted, for only specific people. I mean, I think it's interesting to see the reaction to someone like Elon Musk compared to, say, like a Tyreek Hill, who's a NFL football player who also has a bunch of children from different women, but is not looked upon favorably from this movement. So there's a clear, say, racial component to that as well. And sort of what are we supporting and why? I think it's just so. It's interesting how these lines get blurred so easily, and you find yourself in conversation with Christians, and you're like, only a couple years ago you would have been saying that the problem with our society is absentee fathers, and now you're saying the solution to our society is absentee fathers.
Right. Well, I mean, as you point out, it depends on who the father is and what the practice is. So the tech people who are doing this have lots of money. They have sort of Silicon Valley money, and I think to a lot of Americans, it feels like, well, these are really smart people and they have lots of money and this is their private lives, etc. So they can do what they want to do, compared to, sort of the classic deadbeat dad stereotype. And I think, a lot of it has to do with the fact that the pro-natalist sort of tech people are really practicing eugenics. So I think Simone and Malcolm Collins, who are extremely press hungry, they're a couple of, sort of well-established pronatalists from the tech world. They're both, I think, involved in finance, venture capital. They create their embryos and then select them based on their genetic potential. So they've been doing embryo selection. I think they've had all of their children via IVF. And I think this is kind of common among the tech pronatalists. And so, in their view, they're doing something beneficial for society. So people who are bought in to their line, I think, see sort of deadbeat dads who are non-white, and think they're doing something radically different than Elon, for instance, even though, as you point out, the actual practice is pretty much identical.
Yeah, interesting.
I have to say I didn't know much about this whole pro-natalist movement, so that's really interesting. And I guess the larger point in relation to Christian nationalism is that it's become bound up politically with the Christian promotion of family and the right-wing preservation of family values in a way that you're saying is not really legitimate. Like it's not actually a partner with Christianity in promoting Christian values at all.
Right. The pro-natalist movement in the United States is kind of tripartite. It has these three different streams inside of it. And one of them is the sort of tech pro-natalist, let's create a bunch of embryos and do genetic selection on them. That is one strand of the pro-natalist movement, and I think it's the preeminent one because the tech people have all the money. So a recent pro-natalist conference in March, I think, in Austin, was sponsored by tech money, which gives you a sense of the control they have over the movement. And then you have sort of religious conservatives, people like Catherine Pakaluk, for example, who have a lot of children for religious reasons and are interested in seeing, life made easier for people who have lots of kids, or, incentives to encourage lots of kids if they feel like that's part of the demand of Christianity to sort of go forth and be fruitful. I would say that they're a very junior partner in this coalition. There aren't that many of them involved, and they don't seem to have kind of a pronounced voice in the movement as other people do. And then you have just sort of assorted far-right, non-Christian people who see the pro-natalist movement as a step in, a sort of traditional direction, in terms of women being in the home and there being big families and fathers as provider and protector. I think these, even though the very far right at this point is non-Christian, these strike them as, traditional elements of a nation. And so, I think those are the three sort of pieces of the pro-natalist movement.
Yeah, interesting. And it's, I saw a video about that recent pro-natalist conference, and they found sort of one left-leaning attendant, and he was kind of like, it's straight, obviously there's reasons why if you're not conservative you wouldn't go to an event like that, but the question of where is the left when it comes to, family and the promotion of, theoretically these things would all connect with the desire for, socialized healthcare and maternity leave and all these kinds of things. It does seem like there's a gap on the left that these movements are kind of filling by talking about the family. Is that your sense as well?
Yeah, I think on the left, you've always had, or at least for quite a long time in the United States, this interest in sort of expanding the welfare state and making life easier for people who, have kids. And I don't think the left is hostile to those ideas at all, especially the particular policies like child allowance, for example, universal paid parental leave, for another, subsidized daycare or wages for housework. I think these are all ideas that the left has, had a lot of interest in over time, and they sort of naturally mesh with a pro-natalist outlook. But the left, sort of strongly rejects the pro-natalist approach because they feel like, and this is not entirely wrong, that it's sort of a Trojan horse for, extreme right-wing, behaviors, practices, and perspectives.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you said that this pro-natalism movement emerges out of a fear about a declining birth rate, and that leading to a declining population, but also a top-heavy population with too many people who are too old to work, being supported by very few people who are young enough to work. But from a broader perspective, it seems that you can also solve that same problem, by increased immigration. Mm-hmm. And that is the way that many countries in the West have maintained certain levels of their population, whether they've wanted it that way or not. So, and yet that's why I think it comes back to this whole nationalist question, is that the people who are promoting family because they want to prevent the declining population, they don't want that to be prevented through increased immigration, because that means people from other countries are coming into our country and polluting or diluting our values. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's a significant portion of it. And, I think it's quite possible to disagree with that politics and say, immigrants who come to the United States are, certainly no worse or of less value than Americans. So why worry about increasing native-born American birth rates when you can just invite more immigrants into the country? And I think that's a common sort of left, argument against pronatalism, or argument that pronatalism is sort of a moot question. And I think it has its merits, and I certainly don't disagree with immigration to the United States in general. But I do think immigration is sort of politically, it's a volatile issue. In the United States, it seems to have sort of radically transformed our politics and moved us significantly to the right. And so, I have concerns about, reliance upon mass immigration because, I think you could very well get an even more sort of ferociously screwed up form of politics, relying on immigration in mass. Yeah.
Yeah, it's I think I find that to be such a fascinating question about immigration, right? Is even just the fact that, so many Latin American immigrants in the U.S. voted for Trump. And so this question that on the left, it's often, we have to think about how many people are immigrating here because they're going to transform the kind of political landscape. On the right, they're thinking about the kind of racial and cultural landscape. And so I do think it's helpful to recognize like everyone, is kind of concerned about those questions, and really the issue is just how do we, what do we do with that? And again, that I think points to these different forms of nationalism. How do we understand, what our nation is? What do we value as part of that? So nationalism and immigration being kind of two sides of the same coin, I think is the kind of fascinating piece of this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's sort of a battle for the soul of America, in the view of the people who are, both rejecting immigration and welcoming it. I think both sides feel like they're trying to highlight and preserve a certain aspect of the American tradition, and I understand that. I mean, there are, it's not as though the United States is, completely conceived and born in evil and has no, good qualities. I think there are good qualities that are worthy of preservation. But as you point out, the conflict is in deciding which aspects of Christianity are reflected and which aspects of American, beneficence. And I think that's the controversial part.
Why are you concerned about immigration as a solution to declining population then? You mentioned that a moment ago.
Yeah, I mean, just because of the political, consequences of mass immigration. I don't think immigration is a problem, as I've said, and I'm not against it. But it doesn't seem, sort of ridiculous to me to say, well, birth rates, could be higher and we could have immigration. I think the issue with immigration as a permanent solution, right, is that immigrants who come to the United States, their habits quickly come to match the United States. So their birth rates drop too, once they've been in the United States for
I've seen some of those statistics that basically that people become American quite quickly once they move to America.
Right. And, it also seems to transfer the burden of aging populations to another country, right? Because we're sort of absorbing the young, productive people from those countries, leaving them with their own sort of larger aging populations.
So it's draining those other nations of their best workforce, basically.
Right. And so, in terms of the United States, it's a solution to, declining birth rates. But, globally, you have to look at the total story. And it would seem to be, problematic for those countries who are losing their young, productive workers.
Yeah, one of the things that I find about America personally is just I find that it's very hard to get anyone to think that the main role of society is for that children and young people to flourish in it, right? Like our main purpose is so that they can sort of reach a state where they can pursue the goods that lead to their flourishing, and so providing education and healthcare and housing and all of these kinds of things. It seems like we only talk about children when we're thinking about how they're going to impact us, but basically our politics is devoid of concern for young people. And I don't know if that's a uniquely American thing, but it seems like one of the things that I don't find compelling ever when people are talking about, family values and these birth rates and this kind of stuff is that they're never actually talking about children.
Right, absolutely. They're not talking about children, they're not talking about families, they're not talking about the quality of life for the children who are being born, just life itself. And this is a frustration of mine with the sort of broader pro-life movement, of which I'm a part. I consider myself pro-life. and I have for a long time. But there's a sort of tendency in the pro-life movement, the same thing you're pointing out, to be concerned about birth and the child in the womb, but to sort of lose interest once the child becomes an adult, or not an adult, but an adolescent, a youth. Children need a lot of support, and families need a lot of support in taking care of those children. So this is why I support all of these sort of classical, social democratic policies that would benefit children. Putting more money in parents' pockets when children are at tender ages, etc. Creating free pre-K to sort of start educating and acclimating kids to school when they're little, which makes those transitions easier. I think all of those things are benefit children, but are not necessarily of interest to the sort of broader pro-life or pro-natalist movement. Mm-hmm. In fact, the pro-natalists say that family benefits, in fact, put downward pressure on birth rates, and they point to the sort of Nordic countries with their quite low birth rates and their robust welfare states. But, I think it's sort of misleading, because a lot of research has shown that these programs, which are, sometimes explicitly marketed as pro-natalist programs in European countries, they do lead to a moderate increase in birth rates. So it seems like the Nordic birth rates would be even lower if they didn't have these programs, because, people in the West have the technology to avoid childbirth if they want to.
So also, I don't see the logic as to why it would produce downward pressure, whether or not the statistics bear that out.
Right. I don't see the logic in it either. And I have no idea what the right thinks is going on with the downward pressure. I mean, other than that they think, in general, and this is something the right has thought for, quite a long time, 100 years in America, that social welfare programs undermine the sort of task, the role of the family, and especially the provider. So during welfare reform in the 90s in the United States, this was sort of a common refrain, that welfare replaces the father as provider and promotes sort of single motherhood and all of these socially problematic behaviors in terms of, in the right-wing point of view. And so I imagine their critiques still function along those lines, that, fathers and families have a role in society as protectors, providers, and, this is undermining them, and perhaps that has...
As you could say, it gives the father a greater justification to just abandon the mother if he knows that the mother is going to be supported anyway.
Right.
You could see that argument.
And a lot of these welfare programs in the United States have, sort of marriage penalties in effect, because the benefits are pegged to how much money the parent is making. But if a single mother is receiving benefits based on her low income, and she, marries a male partner who is also quite poor, then you could see the family lose their benefits because their income goes just a smidge above the, qualifying income level. For example, the earned income tax credit, the EITC, they call it hustling backwards. It's when people work hard, poor people work hard or get married and try to improve their situation a bit, and thereby lose welfare programs, access to welfare programs that were extremely important to their family income and were a big part of what was supporting them in their pursuit of, improvement in their life situation.
Well, it's always a problem of where to place the threshold, isn't it? Because the people slightly above the threshold are always going to feel unfairly treated. But I don't quite see how you would solve that.
Well, universal programs.
Yeah.
Which I think are, the sort of gold standard for welfare. I think you see this quite frequently in Europe. For example, your beautiful NHS, which I gladly used and was extremely impressed and enchanted by while I was in the UK. If we had a universal healthcare system, that would sort of change, a lot of calculations about probably family formation and childbirth, because those costs are, extraordinarily high. And you can imagine, even better, universal programs like a child allowance, like a baby box, like a baby bonus. All of these ideas are being debated
Yeah.
in the United States right now, and I think the universal version of these programs are pretty superior.
Yeah, it seems right. It's right now most of our programs in the U.S. are sort of, well, we technically have to help poor people, so here, as opposed to it's our role as a society to support the development of young people and children, and so that's the main thing that we do, right? And so universal programs to do that aren't about, well, sorry that you're poor, I guess we have to help you, but in general, we want to help children of all kinds develop in the ways that they need to, and I. Which strikes me, I mean, that kind of thing strikes me as, again, thinking of Christian nationalism. Like, I think theologically it just makes a lot more sense to me to say, like, we believe that this is how humans work, and right, a society sort of by justice requires that we provide them with the goods necessary to flourish.
Well, it comes down to the thematic problem that we've been talking about, right? Whose Christianity becomes, whose Christianity gets to govern and set the laws and rule. And the problem also that whoever does take power and start enforcing their version of Christian values, they don't call it their version of Christian values. What they say is they're just enforcing Christian values as such. And because they've got so much power, they can't easily be contradicted.
Yeah, exactly. And you can see that, even the kind of gender roles, like you were saying, Liz, I mean, one of the reason, the assumption underlying that idea that social welfare is going to, make fathers leave is that fathers only exist to bring home a paycheck. Right? And that's also not actually a Christian idea historically, but it is a big part of kind of current American evangelicalism, right? Men are supposed to be capitalists, and that's what they offer to their families is capital. And so if the government does that, then they can leave. And again, I just always think, well, theologically, we have a lot of reasons to say that's not what men are for in the family as a primary role. And so it's weird to see, Christians out, rallying behind that, what seems to be an essentially secular capitalist perspective.
I also don't think it's borne out in history across other cultures and across other periods of history that the father was the only person who worked or provided, right? I mean, in most places, both of the parents had to work. Think of farming cultures. Both the parents had to work on the farm all the time, and the kids had to get involved as soon as they were old enough to. So the idea that that traditional values say that the mother should stay at home and the father should work, I don't think history supports that.
No, I don't think so either. I mean, women have always worked. It's always been, non-work has always been a privilege of the, upper classes. Of, for example, aristocrats who had these, inherited land holdings in, sort of medieval feudalism, all the way to, sort of today's capitalists who just receive passive income from the gains associated with their money, their already existent money. So there's definitely non-work at the top. And I think when people imagine a sort of when, especially conservative Christians imagine the ideal family, they're imagining the father's role as essentially being outside the home. And, like you said, bringing home a paycheck, protecting the family from whatever danger or risk. But there's very little said about, father's contributions inside the home, which I think is, a big mistake and a big failing. And I think there's this allergy to women working outside the home. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me in terms of tradition. It seems like it's based on a sort of mid-century model of the
sort of
American
1950s
family.
ideal. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, which I remember. Sarah Williams was a historian, and she talked a lot about how the 1950s was an attempt to go back to the kind of Victorian era where this ideology of separate spheres had developed in the wake of.
It was already a reaction, right? Because the Second World War had seen women going to work in huge numbers because the men were not working; they were off fighting.
That's right. Yeah. So it was. Yeah. It wasn't like, oh, it's always been like this up until the 60s, but rather the 50s were an attempt to recover an idealized version of the Victorian period, which hadn't really been the norm in the U.S. And obviously was, suffocating for enough people that it did not last very long. But I think it's interesting how that looms so large in the imagination. Yeah. I was just wondering if you have thoughts about how your theological training has impacted the work that you do, Liz.
Yeah, well, I certainly take Christianity quite seriously and am concerned about, sort of the content of Christianity and the types of Christianity that are being promoted by these sort of illiberal states. I've thought for a long time about writing a piece that's sort of like their illiberalism and mine, the sort of illiberalism I have in mind when I think of, my big, beautiful Christian socialist utopia. And it's quite different than what I think people surrounding Trump have in mind, like someone like J.D. Vance has in mind when they think about, establishing, a Christian form of governance. I think that's where my theological training comes in, is I can track these arguments and I understand where they're coming from. And I'm not even totally unsympathetic to all of them. But, I have real concerns about the direction that this movement is going. And I feel like it's sort of comical for me personally that I've been like, liberalism sucks, etc. And then when it finally gets dissolved, it's dissolved by the worst people ever. And so, it's bad. It's quite bad for the country, but it's very comical for me personally.
Yeah. Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.